Welcome to English 250, Part 1, Week 4. In this lecture we shall discuss George Orwell's short story, Shooting an Elephant, as well as techniques involved in literary analysis. George Orwell is considered to be one of the foremost writers in England of the 20th century. He's a writer of enormous public appeal, and even if people may not have read his work, his name and thought comes up in many situations. For example, he is seen as a writer who understood, back in the middle of the 20th century, the kind of surveillance societies that now characterize many Western countries, where computer technology is thought to be used more and more as a form of control, social control. Perhaps, though, his most enduring legacy is his analysis of the way language can be used to successfully sustain the kind of official lies that allow a ruling class to serve its narrow interests. His most famous work is, in this respect, is his novel, 1984. That's right, somebody once wrote a novel called 1984. And stranger still, that novel was written in 1948. 48 being an inversion of 84. I recommend you read this. If you find it's not possible to work through the whole novel, there is a very good film available of the same title, 1984, based on the novel. Now, Orwell, let's look at George Orwell himself. George Orwell was born in India in 1903. You will recall that India was under British rule at that time. Orwell's parents, in fact, were minor officials in the British ruling system in India. Orwell returned to England with his parents to attend school, but after finishing high school in 1922, the young man returned to India. This time, he returned to the India of the British Empire, this time to work in Burma as a policeman. In 1927, 5 years later, Orwell, disgusted by what he had seen of imperial power, came back to England, where he lived as a journalist. He lived and worked as a journalist and novelist for the rest of his life. All of his writing is characterized by sharp and critical political insight. Let me just add too that in his adult life, George Orwell also fought in 2 wars. He fought in World War II from 1940 to 1945 against the Nazis. He also fought in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, on the side of the Republicans. Now, Shooting an Elephant is an autobiographical story being based on Orwell's experience in Burma. You will notice in the PowerPoint presentation on Shooting an Elephant that I have not gone through the story event by event. Rather, I have explicated the plot in very general terms. I leave it up to each one of you individually to read through the story and establish what's going on and what belongs where. So I'll go through the plot, but only in very general terms, focusing less on actions and more on some of the ideas floating around the story. Some of the ideas that link the actions of the plot together. At the level of exposition, please note the way attitudes are carefully laid out on the first page. The Burmese have no love or respect for the British, while the British, even this young policeman, despise the people they rule over. The laughter of Burmese is described as hideous, while elsewhere they're described as having sneering yellow faces. The holy men, it is implied, are lazy and have nothing to do but hang around on the streets. These are terms which clearly show how the imperial ruling class sees those they rule after. There is a dehumanization in describing somebody's laughter, somebody's voice as hideous. There is a dehumanization in describing the face, the collective face of a people, as a sneering yellow face. However, the young policeman dislikes the Burmese, he dislikes even more the British Empire that rules over them. This we can call the narrator's predicament. The policeman is hated because he enforces the law of a state that he in turn hates. There is little room here for the young man to exercise his conscience or sense of fairness or justice. He is trapped in a narrow morality of cruelty. There is no room for the development of the self. There's no room for the exercise of the faculties of the self, except those faculties that serve the state in this case. So these are the general ideas, I think, that are laid out in the exposition, and I really want you to pay particular attention to what I've called here the predicament, the situation, the awkward situation of the young policeman, the paradoxical situation of the young policeman. We say in English that he's caught between a rock and a hard place. He's damned if he does, he's damned if he doesn't. This kind of thing. Now, rising action. Here we read the masterly development of the story. As the policeman goes in search of the elephant, a crowd follows him. A crowd that in the end exercises a strange kind of power over him. The gathering crowd turns the event into a kind of comedy or a festival with the policeman as chief clown, despite all his seriousness. Note that nobody is willing to tell him the truth on any subject. Let me just quote from the story from page 22. A story, he starts off by saying, here in the East, a story always sounds clear enough at a distance, but the nearer you get to the scene of events, the vaguer it becomes. Some of the people said that the elephant had gone in one direction. Some said that it had gone in another. Some professed not even to have heard of any elephant. Unquote. I quote these lines because they demonstrate effectively the comedy of the policeman's predicament. The East, according to the policeman, is not a place where he can have access even to the most simple of truths. Thus, his power is a false power. This brings us to a key insight in the story, where the one who has power and holds it illegitimately in the end turns into something like a falsehood, a stuffed dummy, or a mask. Quote, he becomes a sort of hollow, posing dummy, the conventionalized figure of a sahib. For it is the condition of his rule that he shall spend his life in trying to impress the natives, and so in every crisis he has got to do what the natives expect of him. He wears a mask and his face grows to fit it. That's from page 21. What do you make of these lines? The first point that must be made is that the rising action of the plot concerns not only actions. It links actions together and explains them with reference to political ideas. Ideas of, I think, a rather deep philosophical nature, in the sense that the world in the world in which the young policeman finds himself, everything that seems to him real in fact, is not real. In fact, it is a falsehood. The predicament we spoke of earlier, where the young policeman hates the empire he serves and is in turn hated by the population ruled over by the empire, applies not just to individuals, but a whole ruling structure. What is at play here is what they call a dialectical logic, whereby the oppressed population exercises power over imperial functionaries by demonstrating to them their inhumanity. In other words, the oppressed population is a mirror of the true face of the ruler. The oppressed population has the power to shatter the facade of goodness behind which the ruling elite conducts the dirty business of power, hence the comedy of the piece. There is a famous German folk tale called The Emperor's New Clothes. In this folk tale, the emperor is told that the clothes being made for him by an oppressed tailor, one of his subject peoples, are made with such fine and beautiful thread that it is invisible to ordinary people with ordinary eyes. Not invisible, however, to people from the ruling class. In the end, the emperor walks through the streets, proud and arrogant, held head high, clad in his new invisible clothes, only to be laughed at by the subject population because, in fact, the emperor walks through the street naked, with no clothes on at all. In this way, the humiliation of the subject population is deflected back onto the ruler, showing that he has become victim of his own belief in his own goodness, goodness which is really only a form of cruelty. In the PowerPoint, I would suggest that one can take this parable of the emperor's new clothes and apply it to an understanding of George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant. Or, better still, Orwell is in a way rewriting the fable of the emperor's new clothes in a modern 19th, 20th century context. Climax. In the PowerPoint, I pointed out the masterful touches of the writer in prolonging the climax until, in fact, it collapses under its own weight, its own cruelty. The policeman pulls the trigger, the bullet hits the elephant. Quote, in that instant, in too short a time, one would have thought, even for the bullet to get there, a mysterious, terrible change came over the elephant. Page 24. The elephant begins to die, but in so doing remains suspended in time. As a reproach, perhaps, to this act of imperial murder, vandalism, destruction. Thus the climax exhausts itself in an act which turns out to be less a protective measure than an arbitrary act of murder, a destructive exercise in power. In this sense, the elephant is merely the sacrifice that extends the empire's already illegitimate power. Falling action. The policeman simply walks away. There is a discussion. There's a discussion, something like a debriefing, where the whole affair is restored to the reasoning processes of those who have power. Denouement. Here, I think, is a real denouement, a little twist at the end of the story that shapes and reshapes everything that preceded it. It is like a piece of music that ends on an unexpected note. There are two things here in this denouement. One, the death of the elephant serves to protect the ego of the policeman. Two, the death of the coolie is a simple justification for the policeman's crime. He is happy that the coolie died because it justifies his crime. But in being happy, he is, of course, completely dehumanized. And that's the point of the story. Thank you.